the paper is a really nice resource as well for, because it cites so many different studies that look at these kind of genetic link, that via serotonin 2A receptor function to all of these different things. So just as a kind of recap for anyone, the serotonin 2A receptor is the main receptor that psychedelics seem to have their kind of psychedelic effects on. If you block it, it doesn't, you don't hallucinate, you don't trip. But then you kind of cite evidence that genetic variations between individuals in how that receptor gets kind of effectively made by the genes are linked to things like, you just mentioned that there could be a kind of genetic component for just spirituality, right? And there's a bit of you kind of citing evidence on kind of schizotypal and spiritual personality types being linked to variations in the serotonin 2A receptor, which is really kind of interesting idea. That it could even be playing out at that genetic level.
Absolutely, and there it does get tricky because I think with schizophrenia in particular, there's not definitive association between schizophrenia and a variation of the serotonin 2A receptor polymorphisms, except maybe in certain ethnic populations, and then you got that's difficult to tease apart. There does seem to be a link between trait absorption and a variant of the serotonin 2A receptor, and perhaps even a slower experience of time, so subjective time dilation, and a variant of so absolutely. And the paper is chock full of some of that. We actually avoided going too deeply into the at least in terms of psychosis and genetic variants, just because it's such a muddy kind of field, I guess you could call it right now.
Yeah, it's a cool idea that this particular serotonin pathway in the brain could be mediating, as you say, kind of absorption and time dilation. These flow states where you can have these kind of transcendent spiritual experiences of timelessness that are common to everything from psychedelic experiences to near-death experiences, to kind of mystical experiences. Absolutely. So that's nice that you're kind of channeling all this into this one particular pathway in the brain, right? And maybe we should, so with the actual idea, at the front, you're kind of saying that, not to put words in your mouth, but that this pivotal mental state is, it can go positively or negatively, right? It could become psychosis, or it could become kind of a spiritual experience, which is a real kind of reframing from how this stuff, I think, tends to be seen, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we allow for the pivotal mental state to be outcome neutral in the paper because we want it to be a vague and broad construct. But that's not to say that you couldn't look at an individual trajectory and say, that person really looks like they're en route towards a psychosis, or that person really looks, if I had to guess, they're on a healthy spiritual quest. And the types of experiences they're describing seem pretty beneficial and benign. So in individual cases, you might be able to distinguish, but also in terms of when you think about the diagnostic criteria for a psychotic disorder or what's considered a spiritual experience, we label them in retrospect based on the fruits of the experience. So someone could be having hallucinatory phenomenon, alterations in sense of self, ego dissolution of various sorts, magical thinking, belief in prayer or karma, or belief that my mind can change reality, and vice versa, that other minds can influence my mind or behavior. And it's sometimes in the beginning, it's hard to say exactly where these states of mind are going to lead. But in retrospect, we can look at someone and say, wow, look at how dysfunctional that person's become. Clearly a psychotic state. Or in retrospect, that was a harrowing spiritual kind of crisis, but they came out of it for the better, right? And we might label that as so part of our labels actually in terms of the transformations are based on the functional outcomes. And that's one reason why we kind of like our pivotal mental state construct, because we're trying to look at the state that can produce divergent outcomes.
Right. Yeah. And I think this is something I really enjoyed in reading your work, was the feeling that I was reading ideas that kind of had come to me, or that I'd read elsewhere, in a way that was being presented in a very kind of rigorous scientific way. So, like Joseph Campbell was kind of this quote about the psychotic drowning in the same waters that the mystic swims in with delight, or something to that effect. That felt very much like, you're describing it in terms of, rigorous psychological and neurobiological terms. It feels to me like the same phenomena. Do you recognize that as the kind of same phenomenon?
In terms of the connection between what we're saying and Joseph Campbell's, absolutely. And I think I think that's where maybe some of the interest in this piece does come from. Is it really is a rehashing of ideas that have been there for a long time, and phenomenologically, people have known forever spiritual experiences and psychosis phenomenologically very, very related. People have related shamanic phenotypes to psychotic phenotypes for a long time, and so phenomenologically we know they're related, and then kind of getting into maybe the neural mechanisms of how they're actually related. And I think there are perhaps some differences that you can notice going into a pivotal mental state, or even in the incipient phases. And often those revolve around emotionality and interpersonal functioning. So if you look at schizotypy as a construct, which is could be viewed as like a personality trait that is related to schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. So a large aspect of schizotypy is really just measuring psychotic-like thinking. So perceptual aberrations, magical thinking, disorganized thought and speech, which means loose connections between ideas, being able to bounce from ideas to ideas. Whereas the other aspect of schizotypy is really about kind of negative emotions and interpersonal deficits. So suspiciousness, not having close friends, really odd, out of place behavior. And the spirituality piece has those psychotic-like features of schizotypy, the unusual perceptual experiences, the magical thinking, but it doesn't. You don't see those interpersonal deficits or suspiciousness as kind of like suspiciousness, anger, hostility as a defining emotional tone. You would actually see probably like an enhanced sense of connectedness with the world, maybe an enhanced empathy or trust with others. So I think those are important, maybe distinctions.
And is it mainly, do you think the kind of the context during the experience is the main thing that determines that? Like, if you're intentionally in the wilderness trying to have a spiritual experience and it happens, then it's a very positive thing that you're in control of, versus if you're experiencing trauma after trauma and you have no social support, then you're going to kind of spin out into psychosis.
Absolutely. And I think so isolation, if you're willingly isolating yourself in the woods, that can be quite an enjoyable experience. Whereas if you feel like you're being ostracized or persecuted by others, it's much more likely to be a negative experience and predispose you to sort of psychosis. And there's pretty good evidence now that like rates of psychosis amongst African Americans in the U.S. or darker skinned immigrants in Europe are quite a bit higher than kind of white native populations. And there could be multiple factors going into this, but discrimination, persecution, what could all be framed under the label of social defeat, likely contribute to the development of psychotic disorders. And there's a whole social defeat hypothesis of schizophrenia that goes into that, and that's in our paper. But whereas intentionally, isolating yourself, or for that matter, intentionally starving yourself, or intentionally inducing pain for the sake of ritual, these are it's the intentional use of stress to hijack a system for promoting transformation. And I think that to me is probably the most interesting aspect of the whole piece, and maybe for your listeners too, because there's a lot of interest in the psychedelic underpinnings of religion, kind of broadly, because you notice such a phenomenological similarity between the psychedelic state and religious texts or descriptions of religious experiences. Whereas this piece gives us an explanation where it doesn't necessarily just have to be the psychedelics. It can be, ascetic practices inducing psychedelic-like states. So why do all cultures across the world fast and isolate them? Like, why do all these religious exemplars from different traditions isolate themselves? It's probably, there's probably a this stress-induced psychedelic-like signaling that explains the recurrence of these practices, I suspect, and that broadens it broadens what we can view as like contributing to the psychedelic-like nature of religion, because it doesn't just have to be psychedelics now. It can be these practices that induce psychedelic-like signaling.